This is the third time we are talking about the vision of Revelation 4 and 5. Why 3 videos and not 1? Because this vision is foundational to the whole book of Revelation. Everything else in the book flows out of this vision in chapters 4 and 5. If you don't read the book of Revelation in the light of chapters 4 and 5, you won't understand the book of Revelation, especially with what we see in chapter 5. And that's what this video is about. Eugene Peterson reminds us that there is nothing in Revelation that isn't in the Bible already. There are no new truths here. We hear the same truths shown to us in a different way. You could say that chapter 4 is a powerful retelling of what we find in the Old Testament, and that Revelation 5 presents the message of the New Testament. Since it's so important, let's review the highlights of chapter 4, with some new things to think about. Darrell Johnson says that the essential command of the apocalypse of Jesus Christ is look. And he tells us to do this because we haven't really done this yet. Like Peter when he steps out of the boat onto the water. We look at the wrong things, at the turmoil of the waves around us, and then we start to go down. This book exhorts us to look at Jesus and not the turmoil. When we looked in chapter 4, this is what we saw. The one seated on the throne had a scroll in his hand, and the scroll had 7 seals. The scroll contained God's plan for the ultimate fulfillment of his purposes for creation. It's the plan for how the kingdom of heaven will be brought to earth. This was always the plan. Then someone asked a question about who will open it, and remember John was really distressed because no one was worthy? There's this whole cosmic plan all ready to go, and it can't go ahead because the plan is all sealed up. So he weeps and weeps. But then something huge happens. It's so huge that we could say it's the heart of this first vision, and we might even say that it's the heart of all of Scripture. What happens next, when taken into our hearts, will change everything about how we see reality. One of the elders says, "Look, the lion. Not a lion, the lion. He can tear open that scroll with his mighty sinews and his powerful claws." And when John does look, he sees a lamb. And not just a lamb, but a slaughtered lamb. And this lamb is in the center of the throne, in the center of the Almighty. The lion doesn't get to the throne by being a lion. The lion becomes a lamb. A lamb has a whole different way of being than a lion does. Lions rip and tear other animals, but not lambs. Not only do they not have any offensive weapons, they don't even have any defensive weapons. Far from hurting other animals, they always take the hurt. This is the way of a lamb. This is the way of the Lamb. In the throne room with the appearance of the Lamb, there's a lot of singing, and the song that is sung is a new song. Here's the song. "And they sang a new song saying, 'You are worthy to take the scroll and to open its seals because you were slain. And with your blood you purchased for God persons from every tribe and language and people and nation. You have made them to be a kingdom of priests and to serve our God. And they will reign on the earth.'" This song declares 3 things about those who follow the Lamb. They are purchased, they are made a kingdom of priests, and they will reign with him. We will reign with him, or we reign with him. There's some very interesting discussion on the translation of Revelation 5:10. There are some significant ancient manuscripts that use the present tense for all 3 of those things. We are purchased, we are made priests, we reign with him, and not we will reign with him. And in my research, I have discovered that translators say that there is pretty good evidence for both interpretations. Along with Darrell Johnson, I would like to entertain the present tense translation, "and we reign with him," and explore the implications of reigning with the reigning Lamb. There are 3. Reigning with the Lamb involves being a witness to the Lamb. John calls Jesus the faithful witness 3 times in this book. Jesus is witness to the truth, and our job is to be witness to him who is the truth. We need to constantly declare the truth and always live that truth. That is, live as if Jesus were on the throne in heaven right now. Because he is. Reigning with the Lamb involves intercession. This is what priests do. They operate between. Jesus is the great intercessor, and we too are intercessors. We operate between the world and the throne of heaven with our prayers. We bring the brokenness and the suffering and the evil of the world into the presence of the Lamb for his healing. By praying for the world, we enter into its brokenness and suffering and rebellion, and we plead with God, even for our enemies. This is what reigning looks like for the followers of the Lamb that was slain. And this kind of telegraphs the third way that we reign. Reigning with the Lamb involves dying for the kingdom. Being a witness to the truth with our words and with our lives can be dangerous. Sometimes people don't want to hear the truth. And sometimes they really don't want to hear the truth. The Lamb that was slain enters into the brokenness and suffering and evils of the world, and those who reign with him do the same. As Johnson says, evil is overcome in one way, by the power of sacrificial goodness, not by more evil and violence and hatred. We will not overcome evil by imitating it. We will overcome evil by speaking the truth, living the truth, blessing our enemy, turning the other cheek, and enduring the suffering. This is what the King of Kings does. So how can his people do differently? So maybe you no longer want to consider the present tense translation of reigning with Jesus. It might be nicer if we can start reigning with him when it can no longer involve all that suffering and death. The problem is that a change in the verb tense doesn't get us out of the persecution or the suffering. It's going to happen whether we reign and follow him or if we just follow him. Jesus said it when he walked with us on earth. Here's Matthew 10:22 and John 15:18. All this sounds rather weak and foolish, doesn't it? Loving your enemies, submitting, turning the other cheek, embracing suffering. The Bible even acknowledges that it sounds foolish. For the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. But the Bible also tells us that the way of the Lamb that was slain is wiser and stronger. It has 7 horns, and that means complete power, and it has 7 eyes, and that means complete wisdom. Things are not always as they seem. Darrell Johnson retells a story from Fox's Book of Martyrs to illustrate the power of the way of the Lamb. It's the story of a monk named Telemachus. The entry involving Telemachus is called the Last Roman Triumph. A triumph was a traditional celebration of a Roman victory in the capital. It was a gladiatorial reenactment of the last battle. Telemachus has just arrived in Rome on a pilgrimage. Here's his story. After this fortunate victory over the Goths, a triumph, as it was called, was celebrated at Rome. For hundreds of years, successful generals had been awarded this great honor on their return from a victorious campaign. Upon such occasions, the city was given up for days to the marching of troops laden with spoils, and who dragged after them prisoners of war, among whom were often captive kings and conquered generals. This was to be the last Roman triumph, for it celebrated the last Roman victory. Although it had been won by Stilicho, the general, it was the boy emperor, Honorius, who took the credit, entering Rome in the car of victory, and driving to the capital amid the shouts of the populace. Afterward, as was customary on such occasions, there were bloody combats in the Colosseum, where gladiators, armed with swords and spears, fought as furiously as if they were on the field of battle. The first part of the bloody entertainment was finished. The bodies of the dead were dragged off with hooks, and the reddened sand covered with a fresh, clean layer. After this had been done, the gates in the wall of the arena were thrown open, and a number of tall, well-formed men in the prime of youth and strength came forward. Some carried swords, others 3-pronged spears and nets. They marched once around the wall, and stopping before the emperor, held up their weapons at arm's length, and with one voice they sounded out their greeting. Ave Caesar, morituri te salutant. Hail Caesar, those who are about to die salute thee. The combats now began again. The gladiators with nets tried to entangle those with swords, and when they succeeded, mercilessly stabbed their antagonist to death with the 3-pronged spear. When a gladiator had wounded his adversary and had him lying helpless at his feet, he looked up at the eager faces of the spectators and cried out, Hoc habet! He has it! And awaited the pleasure of the audience to kill or spare. If the spectators held out their hands toward him, with thumbs upward, the defeated man was taken away, to recover, if possible, from his wounds. But if the fatal sign of thumbs down was given, the conquered was to be slain. And if he showed any reluctance to present his neck for the death blow, there was a scornful shout from the galleries. Recipe ferum! Receive the steel! Privileged persons among the audience would even descend into the arena to better witness the death agonies of some unusually brave victim before his corpse was dragged out at the death gate. The show went on. Many had been slain, and the people, madly excited by the desperate bravery of those who continued to fight, shouted their applause. But suddenly there was an interruption. a rudely clad, robed figure appeared for a moment among the audience, and then boldly leaped down into the arena. He was seen to be a man of rough but imposing presence, bareheaded with a sun-browned face. Without hesitating an instant, he advanced upon two gladiators engaged in a life-and-death struggle, and laying his hands upon one of them, sternly reproved him for shedding innocent blood, and then turning toward the thousands of angry faces ranged around him, called upon them in a solemn, deep-toned voice which resounded through the deep enclosure. These were his words: "Do not requite God's mercy in turning away the sword of your enemies by murdering each other." Angry shouts and cries at once drowned his voice. "This is no place for preaching. The old customs of Rome must be observed. On, gladiators!" Thrusting aside the stranger, the gladiators would have again attacked each other, but the man stood between, holding them apart, and trying in vain to be heard. "Sedition! Sedition! Down with him!" was then the cry. And the gladiators, enraged at the interference of an outsider with their chosen vocation, at once stabbed him to death. Stones and whatever missiles came to hand also rained down upon him from the furious people, and thus he perished in the midst of the arena. His dress showed him to be one of the hermits who vowed themselves to a holy life of prayer and self-denial, and who were reverenced by even the thoughtless and combat-loving Romans. The few who knew him told how he had come from the wilds of Asia on a pilgrimage to visit the churches and to keep his Christmas at Rome. They knew he was a holy man, and that his name was Telemachus, no more. His spirit had been stirred by the sight of thousands flocking to see men slaughter one another, and in his simple-hearted zeal he had tried to convince them of the cruelty and wickedness of their conduct. He had died, but not in vain. His work was accomplished at the moment that he was struck down. For the shock of such a death before their eyes turned the hearts of the people. They saw the hideous aspects of the favorite vice to which they had blindly surrendered themselves. And from the day that Telemachus fell dead in the Colosseum, no other fight of gladiators was ever held there. What Telemachus did looks really weak and foolish, doesn't it? But it broke the back of evil. And this isn't the only time in human history that this kind of thing has happened. It happens all the time. Things are not always as they seem. Thank you, and we will see you next time when we talk about the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And a lot more. We'll see you there.